little bit, I don't know, my complexion a little bit darker, and she just felt she was so black, and that she was treated poorly by her family because of this. And this colorism, this is what black people suffer from. Black people go one way, well, we'll write a law against that. Black people go another way, we'll write a law against that. That's why I say wrote and written.
Just giving a little bit of background, you said that God was your hero. So what does that mean to you?
The embrace or love.
Hello, good people. Welcome back to another episode of Sit Down with the Author. I am your host, Miss Y. We are sitting down again with Miss K to glean at her feet. We are studying the Emancipated Gospel, looking at chapter 11 now, the genesis of Judeo-Christianity in Africa. So, Miss K, it has been quite a while since we sat down.
I'm so happy to be here with my daughter. I'm happy to be here and sharing this from this generation to that generation. And that's how we have to share this knowledge. It needs to pass on from generation to generation. And I'm grateful that you picked this up, Miss Y.
Yes, I'm grateful to spend this time. A lot of times you're not able to do this. So, I mean, these things can go in the archives. A mother-daughter duo, We're gonna fast forward. We did the preface in chapters 1 through 4 previously, and we're gonna jump around, but we still encourage you to go ahead and get the book. If you have not got your book already, go ahead and go to Amazon.com, The Emancipated Gospel, An African American Struggle for Spiritual Liberty. So we're going to jump in. What we usually do is have several points throughout the chapter. I'll go ahead and read the passages. We're going to ask Ms. K for one word that comes to mind after she hears that passage, and then we'll dive into some explanation. So let's go ahead and get started. The first passage is actually an excerpt taken from Charles Bradford's. He says, the basic biblical declaration about the human family is that we all issue from common stock. The river of humanity and the river of Eden are both single streams. There is only one headwater, one source. The same water flows in every branch. There are no human beings on earth who spring from a different source. I found that very powerful, but one word that you would say sums that up.
Pedigree.
Now, we've had some conversation about this before. I think that your take on that is very interesting. Pedigree, explain to me what that means.
So when I think about the Afro-Asiatics, as Charles Bradford is saying, that we all flow from the same river, the human race comes from the same river. It's important when we look at people in the Bible, people in now times, that we understand that we're all the same people. And why? If we look at politics right now, we look at television, we look at the YouTube, we see all these different tribes and people ascribing to certain schools of thoughts, and sometimes they're head to head against other thoughts. It's important for us to realize that we're all the same people. Why? So that we don't blow our world up with our fighting against one another. But when I think about this word pedigree comes from genealogy. And in the Bible, I think about, am I supposed to be talking about African culture in the Bible? We're supposed to be looking at Jesus and how he saved us. And the Bible says that we're not supposed to concern ourselves with foolish genealogies. So I want to go to that in the Bible so we can get context. There's this question, there's this ruminating that we have. Are we really supposed to be going that far to redeem ourselves from thoughts about ourselves that have been put in there because of certain curses that have been put on Black people? Or are we just supposed to look up at the cross of Jesus Christ and live? And so I delved into this word pedigree. The scripture is 1 Timothy 1:4-7. It says, neither give heed to fables and endless genealogies, which minister questions rather than godly edifying, which is in faith. So do. So now this question comes to my mind. Neither give heed to fables and endless genealogies. Now, when we go to the book of Titus, it says, but avoid foolish questions and genealogies and contentions and strivings about the law. So in those scriptures, it's not just talking about genealogies, it's talking about genealogies when they come in, or they advocate the law and come against faith. Now, when we talk about pedigrees, we talk about, I come from the Rothschilds, and my family came from the English, and we don't even have any Irish blood. We're purebred. Or you talk about pedigree, you look at dogs and how this dog, you look at their papers and their parents were the same breed of dog back and back and back. Pedigree is very important to the American mind, or the minds of nobility. Not just in America, they do it everywhere. Who are the aristocrats of this group? That's pedigree. Now, what Paul says in the book of Philippians, he said, well, if we want to talk about pedigree or genealogies, I can boast more than any of you. I was born a Jew, and I was circumcised on the 8th day, and I'm from the tribe of Benjamin, and I'm a Pharisee, and I persecuted the Christians, and according to the law, I was faultless. But I counted all that dung for knowing Jesus Christ. So now the question still becomes, are we right to talk about these Afro-Asiatic people? Shouldn't we just believe in the gospel and believe in Jesus Christ? And I pondered that. And I looked at that word genealogies. One definition for genealogies is pedigree. But when we're talking about the genealogy of Jesus Christ, we're not looking at that same word. That word means Genesis, or beginning, or family of origin. So there are those who deal with pedigree, and they're actually looking for bloodlines which are perfect and which are good. They write out what is not good about the family, and they just uphold what is good. Now that's called a lie. Now, when you're dealing with Genesis, you're dealing with the whole thing, the good, the bad, and the ugly, the true history. So when we look at Christian nationalism or Christianity that has grown in this country, I'm looking at the sense of pedigree. Not across the board. There is true Christianity here, but there is a type of Christianity that is infused with this sense of perfection. And that type of Christianity says that Black people were born of the curse of Ham. So as Paul says that if you're going to brag about your pedigree, I'm a Jew of Jews. Black people could say, well, if you're going to boast about your pedigree, look at our pedigree. We are from the land of the Afro-Asiatics. We are from the Hamido-Semitic lands, which means we are from the land of the original Christians. Now, God didn't call us to boast. He called us to boast in Jesus Christ. So as we call our righteousness filthy, dirty rags, we have to call it as it is. But as I've said before, I used to think, Black people speak slang. And one slang we used to say in the 60s was, can you dig it? And we might want to know where these slang words come from. Black people had to realize that we have to dig deep to understand who we are. You dig it?
Can you dig it? Very good. So the next passage we have, it says, from a geographical standpoint, all people were given a common footing at creation. And if we subscribe to the story of creation, we must all trace our origins to these rivers, which we can now identify as denoting Afro-Asiatic geography.
Oldest.
Oldest.
The Afro-Asiatic language is the oldest language group spoken on the earth. Oldest. Another name for Afro-Asiatic is Hamido-Semitic. When you think of Semitic, you're thinking of Shemites, or the son of Noah, Shem. And when you're thinking of Hamites, you're speaking of the son of Noah, Ham. You're looking at Egypt, Ethiopia, Cush. We know that as Africa. And Shemites, we're looking at people who came from Mesopotamia. Abram came from Mesopotamia, and he went into the land of Ham, or he went to the land of the Ethiopians and the Babylonians and the Egyptians.
So my question, we talk about from a geographical standpoint. Why is that important? The geography
Yes,
of it.
okay. I love that question. So John Henry Clark says that when we look at history, we're looking at the map of human geography. And geography shows us where we are, where we have been, where we need to go. We study geography, we study archaeology, and listening to archaeology is the study of artifacts so that we can sort of piece together a history. And when you're dealing with Black history, we have to study archaeology, even archaeological digs of evidence or writings, because the story has been messed up so much in order to justify pedigree. In order to justify genealogies, the story of our history has been squashed and mashed. So geography shows us where the Bible lands are. And if you look at the map, you'll say, man, that's Africa. But in our mind, we say, well, that wasn't Africa, that was the Bible lands. And we don't think it's the same. But as I look at the map, I have to look at the map over and over again, even in my mind, because that's not what I was taught in school, and that's not what I was taught in church. But my mind says, well, that looks like Africa, and Rome was right by Africa. And the Mediterranean Sea, we're in the land of the Greeks, we're in the land of the Romans, we're in the land of the Africans, and we're in the land of the Bible, and we're in the land of Canaan, we're in Egypt. So it's very important to understand geography so you can see where this was going on. So we can see that, yeah, we were there. We were taken away from there.
Mm-hmm. Very good. So the next passage, if you are familiar with the Bible, you know that Abraham was called out to another land, right? So this passage says, millennia after the children of Ham grew mighty, Abram was called from his father's house to become the world's spiritual leader. Abram was called the Hebrew, which literally means traveler. He traveled by the call of God, seeking a city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. One word.
Hebrew.
Before you go further with that, when it hit me when it says that Hebrew literally means traveler. You have a lot of people currently, Black people, who now identify as Hebrew. And you have people who classify themselves as Jews who feel that certain things said by Hebrews are anti-Semitic. If Hebrew means traveler, then that doesn't necessarily belong to one group of people. Is that right?
Right. So the Hebrews came from Mesopotamia and they traveled in the land of Ham. The people in the land of Ham, if you look at the table of nations in the book of Genesis, chapter 11, and do the math, you will realize that before the Hebrews came into that land, the Hamites have been developing cities, developing language, developing writing for about 4,000 years. So when they saw these new people coming, they realized that they were travelers. They were Hebrews.
Right.
And this is important to understand, that God didn't choose these Hebrews because they were great, because they were not. In the eyes of the people, the Hamites that were there already, they were not. They were a small people. And that's why it was amazing how God flourished them in that land. But it wasn't without consent. Of course, the Hamites did not have to consent, because God is God and he could do whatever he wants to with his people. All of these people were his. The Shemites, the Japhethites, and the Hamites. They all came out of the ark. They all came from Noah. They are the people that were saved after the flood. They all belong to God. Our understanding of sex or sects of people and how we understand them from a Western worldview has to do with domination and subjugation. It's not new, because there were Hamites before. Like I said, they were in this land for a long time, who subjugated people as well. So this has been going on. So the debate about who is who, which becomes very toxic sometimes, because it goes to the point where some people will say, well, you're not that, And therefore, if you say that about those, then you should be censored. So you have to understand that just as America's a melting pot, the land of the Bible was a melting pot. This is nothing new. There were people intermarrying, and there was no laws against misogyny where you couldn't marry another race, though there were preferences.
Right.
But Abraham became the father of many nations, and it wasn't just because all nations would come to him. He had children from women from different lands. There were Hamitic and Semitic children. So Abraham's progeny were Afro-Asiatic. So how do we add that up? What does that look like today? Who does that look like today? It looks like people who have sometimes say been amalgamated or hybridized, but these are people. And if we go back to the original question, what does it mean that we all issue from the same headwater, the same stock? We are all people of God. There is very little difference in any of the races of the earth. Very small genetic difference.
I remember just briefly, I just love this interaction. I was getting my blood drawn for something, and it was very, very cold in the lab. And I said to the lady, "It's so cold in here. How do you deal with it?" And knowing that I had my stereotype of she was Russian, of Russian people, thinking that it's freezing cold over there. And she's, I wear long sleeves all the time. And she says, I'm from Russia, but it's not just always cold over there. It's not what people think. And we don't all always drink and everything. She says, we have all the seasons. She says, I've drawn blood for many years. All of our blood is red. And, the stereotypes that we have about people, stereotypes may start from a seed of truth, but they're not always true and they're not always applicable to everybody. Our next passage is very short and we touched on it. But maybe I want you to expound a little bit more based off of this passage. It's a quote that you got from another writer. It says, Yahweh indicates here, when Abraham is taken from a different land, his indifference to bloodlines. So just context, we talked about Abraham was called from his father's house to become the world's spiritual leader. And previously it says with Abraham, world history takes a different track. God establishes a new pattern. But this was important. It says Yahweh indicates here in this new pattern, his indifference to bloodlines.
Us.
One word.
Yeah. All of us. Mom and them. Their mom and them. The Russians mom and them. The Indian mom and them. Ethiopian mom and them. All their mom and them. We all are the same people.
Right.
We have gone through this conditioning process. What was his name? Field. I think he was some sort of scientist. This man said that there are 3 races. He said there are Caucasoid, Mongoloid, and Negroid. And so we have this understanding that there are 3 races, but it's been made up. It's a characterization of people. Arbitrarily, well, if you're black, you belong to this race. If you're white, you belong to this race. And if you're yellow or you have that skin fold, your eyes are slanted, you belong to this race. That is a man's characterization of humanity. And it didn't just stop at outward characteristics. It went to, certain social characteristics, how certain people acted. And then there were inferences and assumptions made about people from these newly created races. And then this framework was created and taught and disseminated. And so people tended to gravitate toward these areas. And for those who were favored in this framework, they have not just an advantage, but they have incentive to keep that framework in place.
Interesting. So Michael M. Hiller is an archaeologist and theologian, and you attended a lecture, and this is what he said about Egyptians. He said that at the time, there was let me just give background. There's an approximate 3,000 year gap between the time when the earth was repopulated after the flood.
So I said
and then
4,000,
when God
3,000.
chose Abraham. Okay. 4,000, 3,000. So at the time, Egyptians were the light bearers and that the Greek word for pyramid means house of light. Hiller stated that during this gap period, evidence reveals that Egypt was the most spiritually and intellectually advanced civilization, and that its religion had many things in common with Judaism. One word.
Wow.
Wow. And what is the significance? I feel we were on a panel, a different panel. We were discussing things, you and I, and then someone brought up Egyptology. There's always this idea that Egyptians are polytheistic, and I saw the faces of people when you said this, like, why are you advocating for Egyptians? You said that the Hyksos, which came into power during Moses's time. The Bible talks about this being a pharaoh who did not know Joseph. What is the importance that they had many things in common with Judaism? And when we talk about a pyramid being the house of light, why is that important? Why do we bring that?
Michael Hiller brought out, he's an archaeologist and a theologian. He showed that those pyramids are everywhere on the earth. They're not just in Egypt. There are pyramids in the Americas. There are pyramids in Asia. There are pyramids under the sand in the desert, meaning that these were evangelists. The Egyptians were evangelists. They were going around the world talking about the one God. There's a book written, they came before Christopher Columbus, showing that the Egyptians came to the Americas on, get this, papyrus ships. Now, that is very difficult for me to believe, because when I think of papyrus, I think of straw. I think of mats. They had to be very ingenious to make that go across the water. But it's written that they did. Whether they came in papyrus or whatever, because since it's hard for me to believe, doesn't mean it didn't happen. Whatever, they came to the Americas before the Europeans came to the Americas. They went into the desert. Now, this that I'm talking about is like, really? Somebody just made that up. Or you're just saying that. Well, yeah, maybe you could say that I'm just saying that. But there's so much that has been written wrong in history that has to be dug up. I mean, we have to dig that's plausible. So another thing that is plausible is that, and we get it from the Bible, is that the Pharaoh worked with Joseph. This is not like antebellum South, where if you decided to listen to a black man tell you something, you had to hide it, because if anybody else knew that you were talking to this black man, you would be anathema, or you would be excommunicated, or you would be labeled as a black person lover. This was not like that. We have to really expand our mind to understand ancient times. That Pharaoh and Joseph were on the same footing. After Joseph was thrown into jail because it was assumed that he went after Potiphar's wife, and he had dreams, and it was clear that God was talking to this man. And Pharaoh had this dream that Joseph could interpret. Joseph and Pharaoh worked together, and they created a healthy space for the whole then known world, that Afro-Asiatic world, creating a space for the Hebrews, the travelers, a space for the travelers to call home, probably for their first time. The land of Goshen became their home. They were in Egypt. Now, it's very telling that men came from the east to find Jesus. They followed his star. These were not Hebrews, which tells us that somebody else was looking for Jesus. Even the Jews were not looking for Jesus, but somebody that were not Jews were looking for Jesus. That tells you right there that there was the worship of one God before. And not only that, they were looking for a Messiah. Now, I like to look at the fact that Joseph, as told by God in a dream, took Jesus and Mary to Egypt and stayed there for 2 years. And I like to think about this. Maybe God presented this Savior that the Egyptians were looking for long before the Hebrews were in their land, and let him stay there for 2 years. This is the Messiah that even the Egyptians were looking for. And it was these men, these wise men of the East, that signaled his coming there, even to the one that would kill him. In the same way that the Hebrews were killed by the Hyksos, who had taken over the other Egyptians that had a friendship with the Jews. She was looking at a people who would drop all of their ties to the earth and be tied to the Messiah.
Very good. So we're moving on to the heading, the culture of the Kalenjin Nilots. The Nilots are peoples who descended from the Egyptians. They migrated down the River Nile or Nile Valley, moving to different places to feed their cattle. That's just giving a background on who we're talking about. So you interviewed Sabina Bet, who is a Kalenjin, and she says this: the Assis, the infinite, represented God. You were blessed with these words: may the sun rise on you. In other words, may you live tomorrow. God also represented daytime. The sun in the sky is called Asista. One word.
Genealogy. So, I don't know if you've ever heard of the goddess Isis. Isis, definitely Egyptian. The Kalenjin language calls the sun Isis. Isis is known as the sun goddess. Now, we have always shown that the Egyptians worship the sun. And this is a great opportunity to see really the intersection between the Kalenjin religion, the Christian religion, the Egyptian religion. We say that the Son of Righteousness shall arise with healing in his wings. In Egypt, you might call that maybe the phoenix. But we understand that there is that God is the creator of the sun, but he is powerful. The Bible says more powerful than the sun. We don't worship the sun, but he is the Son of Righteousness that arises with healing in his wings. The book of Peter says that the day star shall arise. And there are many, if you go to the book of John, he is the light, and that is the light of all mankind. The light shines in darkness, and the darkness does not comprehend it. So there are many Christian analogies to the sun. Whereas when we try to vilify the Egyptians, we say, well, they worship the sun. We worship the Son of God. This is different than saying we venerate the sun and we will have a day of veneration for the sun and calling it Sunday. There's a difference there.
Right. I find it interesting, and this is an opinion of mine. I'm not an expert on this, but I find it interesting that you have Greek mythology. From what I know of Greek mythology, you have other cultures in East Indian cultures, and we all kind of have like these similar things. Oh yeah, we have a story of that too in here, and we have a story of that too in here. Oh yeah, we have a story of that too. And I not just interesting, but fascinating that through it all, there's this thread. Even when things are changed just a little bit, history is important because it's passed down in different languages. Maybe it's distorted a little bit, but everybody is trying to say the same thing. And God is showing himself in all these different cultures. And at some time, they're going to acknowledge the one true God. But if you stop and look, there is a common thread that goes throughout many religions and many cultures.
We believe that all mankind comes from the same place. And it gets muddy when you have people, well, there is no God. I don't believe in God. And that's just your belief. Well, okay, there's no sky and there's no ground. And I don't believe there is. Well, you have to believe there's a ground because you're standing on it. So now this is scientific, right? this is science. But there are certain things that science cannot see. They don't know. So let's just make an assumption that all people came from the same place. We are all coming from the same place. And that place is the beginning, or Genesis. We came from a space where we all had the same understanding of life, and we spread from that understanding. Okay, it has become very convoluted, wherein, now, this is an example. We would say 500 BC, but that's not BC anymore. It's 500 BCE, because in order to say BC, you'd have to say before Christ. And there's a new language that does not acknowledge Christ. So instead of saying AD, it's CE. In order to disavow or not acknowledge God, you have to change language. You have to change how we talk about things.
I remember when you said that to me. The language has been there for centuries. That's the language, which is another testament of who God is.
So, in order to, the linguists used to call the language, which is Afro-Asiatic languages, there are 6 of them: the Amazi, the Amadic, the Cushitic, the Semitic, the Egyptian, which is extinct, in the Chadic. So it was called Hamido-Semitic. But when you call it Hamido-Semitic, you have to acknowledge Ham, the child of Noah, and Shem, the child of Noah. So now scientists are saying, well, you can't really say there's a Hamitic language branch. You can say Semitic, so they don't want to use that term. They'll just use Afro-Asiatic.
Yeah, so according to Britannica that you had me look up, they were saying we can't use Hamitic because it's not an actual language pattern.
So now if you think about the Egyptian language being extinct, you have to ask why. This is where archaeology comes in. Why is it not a language anymore? And why is the Arabic language, there's so many Arabic speakers? Well, if you look from a historic standpoint, the Muslims spread across Africa like wildfire, and they changed languages. People start speaking Arabic. They change religions. People start becoming Muslim. That's how languages become extinct. If you look at the Amazi, which were free people who many, many ancient years, they came from Egypt, ancient. And they went across, they went to the desert. They were able to live in the desert. And there's much study that needs to be done about the Amazi. Now, Amazi many of them look white. Not all of them. And many of them are fighting for the fact that they're white. But they were mixed. Their language became changed. Many of their languages became Muslim or Islamic languages. They became extinct. Why? Because they were intermingled with the Muslims. The Egyptian language became extinct. The Egyptians were Christians. What happened to them? What happened? They died in gladiator sports. They were persecuted for being Christians. So they were changed into Muslims, because if you look at Egypt now, most of the people are Muslims. So what happened to the languages? They changed. They were extinct.
Very good. Our next passage, under the heading The Hebrews and Hamitic Monotheists. All 3 of the children of Noah at some point cooperated in the spread of the gospel, sometimes willingly. Even in their humanity and their often degenerate relational habits, God put these peoples together to bless the world. Yet before all these brothers were on a one-world stage relating, there were the Afro-Asiatics.
So it seems really curious to me. The Bible shows in the book of Genesis where Noah was drinking wine and his son saw him naked, told his brothers, and he cursed Canaan because of that. And now Canaan was going to be a slave to Japheth and to Shem. That the reading of that scripture put some things into place. That looks like the Semites and the Japhethites were a confederate together, and that the Hamites would be their slaves. But I say curse because I'm looking at Hamido-Semitic people. I'm looking at Hamites and Shemites living together. I'm looking at Afro-Asiatics living together. I don't see the Japhethites and during this period of time, and the Shemites in a coalition. Now, these days, I do. So when I look at it then, they actually, as Charles Bradford said, were in and out of one another's homes like neighbors' children. Not only that, they weren't just, they were in and out of one another's homes. They were mixed. You can really not pull them apart. Jesus himself was Semitic. We know that he had Hamitic blood because Ruth is one of his ancestors, and Ruth came from the Moabites. That's a Hamitic people. And we also know that Rahab was one of his ancestors, and she was from the land of Canaan. So at least we know that. You look at Ishmaelites, the Ishmaelites, their mother was from Egypt. You look at the Midianites and the other 5 sons that came from Keturah. It appears, even though it doesn't say that Keturah was a Hamite, we don't see where Abraham went back to his land and got Keturah and brought her back, as we see him sending Jacob to get somebody to bring her back. So it's likely that Keturah was a Hamite, though if you look into sources, they will say that she was a Israelite or a Shemite. I haven't dug deep enough to find out. But one thing we do know is that Midian, Jethro, who was a child of Midian, was a child of Esau. And Esau only married Hamites. The Bible shows us that his family was upset with him marrying Hamites. They sent Jacob to get a wife from Laban's house, but Esau married Hamites. So all the children that come from Esau, Afro-Asiatic. So they were mixed. Judah, Tamar. These people lived in the land of Ham. Of course, they were mixed. It was impossible for them not to be mixed. Though some of them sent back home to get some people, most of them did not. Most of them married the women in the land that they were in.
So you touched on a point that is going to be on our part 2 of chapter 11, because we want to do kind of a deep dive into genealogy. So what we're going to discuss next is Moses and Jethro, and then Melchizedek and Abram. And looking back at the Bible and looking at some lineage, and break that down on part 2. Before we leave, though, I did want to read this last passage. We close this portion of chapter 11. I thought this was a very important point to end on, because, we started out with chapter 1, chapter 2, we were kind of in America, right? And now we're going into Africa, into the Bible lands, into this genealogy. And this is bringing it back and kind of bringing the two together. This passage says, the world was not always the way Dred Scott found it. Black people were not always locked down in cages, blinded and looking for keys to get out. Historically, Africans were at the epicenter, at the place of new beginnings. One word.
I thought about E.T. Phone Home. I don't know how many people listening remember E.T. because you could be very young and don't remember E.T., but that movie was out when I was a teenager and I'm in my 60s now. But E.T. was an alien. He wasn't in his own home, but he wanted to go home. And people didn't understand him. They didn't see him. It was just these great, big, beautiful eyes that made you fall in love with E.T. And there was a little boy that wanted to help him to go back home. And I think about home and the lies and the earth that has been poured upon us, specifically me. I take this personally, like to just dig out and find that I was not born in a slave ship. My ancestors were not born in slave ships. That we have a real history. We have a righteous history. We have a history wherein we were connected with the creator of the universe. Tone. Yeah, you feel it. We dug it up, didn't we? We got down there to the dig. Home is home. Don't ever go back to not knowing home.
Yeah. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Sit Down with the Author. I have been your host, Miss Y, and we are discussing the Emancipated Gospel. Please tune in next time. Make sure you like, subscribe, and share this video. Until next time, the Emancipated Gospel.